Hi, InStylers. I'm Raquel Willis, and I'm your host for a fabulous conversation for the 30th anniversary beauty and style issue for InStyle magazine. So we have some fabulous panelists here with us today, and I'm so excited because these are two powerful figures, particularly for me as a Black trans woman that I have looked up to for years. So first we have the amazing Tracey Africa Norman. She began her career as a makeup artist and fashion stylist, but she was also the first African-American trans woman model to appear on a box of Clairol in the 1970s. So she went up, honey, in the drugstores. She is originally from Newark, New Jersey, and Africa has modeled and been photographed for publications like Essence, Vogue Italia, and Harper's Bazaar India. Welcome, Tracey Africa Norman.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So we also have the amazing Juliana Huxtable, who is an artist, DJ, musician, and sometimes model. She excels in probing dormant and marginalized histories, narratives, and technologies to challenge discourses around contemporary perceptions of identity, futurity, and politics. So you are going to get so many different dimensions in our conversation.
Yay.
Welcome. So let's just jump right in because y'all are two figures who are so inspirational to so many folks in our community. But what inspired you in your career to start in art and in fashion?
Well, what started me doing fashion was a friend of mine who I knew before my transition. And so it took a few years. I had separated from that group of people because I was doing, my thing. And I didn't know how they would accept it. So I just became the woman that I am today. Mm-hmm. And I was downtown in my city of Newark, and I ran into the friend who came out of the store. He recognized me. I guess he heard through the grapevine what my new name was. And so we had a conversation, and he was checking me out, and he was saying, "You look really beautiful. You should think about modeling." And I was like, okay. And so from that moment on, there were local designers, local makeup people, and I started working with them. Mm-hmm. And that's where my training started, in Newark.
And so this was the 70s, right?
Yes.
So who were some of the figures that you were looking to?
To be honest with you, I didn't have anybody to look up to as far as fashion was concerned because my head was somewhere else. I had no clue after I graduated high school exactly what I was going to do. Mm-hmm. I was raised by a single mom, so my thought process changed because she wasn't able to afford what I wanted to do for, my life. Mm-hmm. And so when I met my friend Tommy, then my life changed. Yeah. So it just started from there.
Well, shout out to Tommy for being a real one. Yeah. So Juliana, you have risen to such a high level within our community, but I remember first seeing you online, right? There was always this kind of digital component to your work and to your presence, but can you tell us a little bit more about how you got started in art and fashion and becoming a style icon?
I've always loved art, but art in a total sense, and so I feel like that's always encompassed multiple things. I've loved fashion since I was a kid, and when I was 3, I declared that I was going to be a poet and a painter to my parents. And then at some point I thought I was going to be a fashion designer, but I would cycle through so many different imaginations of what I could be, I think because it's hard for me to pick obviously it's hard for me to pick a single thing, but I didn't study art or fashion. I studied literature and gender studies, and I moved to New York, and I was working at the ACLU actually. And my distraction when I had downtime at my job, when I would have like a lunch break or something, I worked actually not far from here, I was in the financial district. And I never took really my lunch breaks, at least I didn't travel, I would just get on Tumblr. And so Tumblr and digital communities, which have always been something that I've been drawn to. I was a blogger for years, but something about being in New York, there's really a feedback loop between online communities, at least at the time, and especially Tumblr was my main outlet, and then people that you could meet and go out. And so you could really have this kind of one could feed into the other. And so I built an audience by just sharing my thoughts, sharing early sketches, sharing early images. And so that's really how everything started. What I loved about the sort of digital world is that if I didn't see it in the world, I could just make it myself. And I used myself as the means for that. And so my first modeling gigs were just out of people following me and being like, oh, you have a cool sense of style. My first writing gigs, art stuff, it all came from people who had either followed me, what I was doing online, or that had found out about me through someone that did that. And so really early on, I was quite lucky in that my sort of expression of my imagination and desires online almost kind of became a sort of manifestation. And so by my second year at the ACLU, I was like modeling and doing performances and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I hear from both of y'all's stories so much power in having community, right? Having at least one or two people, if not more, who saw what you were doing and saw your light, saw your potential. But you had to make the decision to take advantage of those opportunities as they were presented to you. And I think y'all both modeled that so brilliantly in your history. But can you talk a little bit more about maybe what barriers there were? I mean, you both said in some way there wasn't kind of this path that was laid out for you. You kind of had to cobble it together. Right. But what were some of those barriers for you, especially when it came to identity and just who you were in the world?
For me, as a child growing up, I didn't grow up around gay people. So my visual and study pattern was always women. I looked at different women because all of my teachers were basically women. So I studied them. I studied how they walked, how they dressed, how they talked, and how they communicated with each other. The females in class I made friends with, and I was in, just studying. That's what I did. And so when I started, I would say, my career in Newark, there were a lot of very talented people, makeup artists, hairdressers, dancers, actors. And so there was designers that took me under their wing. The makeup artist's name was Al Grundy, and he had a brother by the name of Dow Grundy. And so I became their muse. And that's where I learned how to walk at their house. And he was a tyrant. He would have you walk down this long hallway and back. He said, again, and again, and again. And then he would say that, oh, Tracey, we got to do something about those bow legs because you can't walk down the runway looking like Annie Oakley. Because I'm not knowing what I'm doing. So I had learned, and he had started sending me out to 7th Avenue because he worked for a woman by the name of Audrey Smalls. And she had a business that were dressing the models backstage. And so he would have that information. He would give me that information, and the next morning I would get up and I would go see Halston, I would go see Donna Karan, I would go see Oscar de la Renta, and then all of these people that he was sending me to. It was easy for me to get in because he told me just carry your portfolio and tell him that you are, that you're an artist and that you go to FIT. And that's how I was able to get into the shows. So while I was in the show, I would just watch how the professionals did it. And the first thing that I picked up is that every single model was walking with one foot in front of the other. And that's something I wasn't doing at his house. So when I got back home, I put on my heels, I put the mirror up on my bedroom door, and I walked down my own hallway back and forth until I got it right. And so then I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time because he sent me to the Pierre Hotel, and I'm thinking that at that time I was going to see another fashion show. But when I was across the street, I noticed girls from Essence magazine that were meeting girls that were coming out of the hotel. I was just standing there watching to see what was going on. They embraced each other and they said hi, and then the group that was coming out of the hotel walked down the street, the group that was going to the hotel. Then I just ran across the street in between traffic. It wasn't, it was a green light for them, but I was running across the street to catch them. So I walked behind them in the hotel thinking, okay, so I'm going into the ballroom and I'm going to get my place and I'm going to, see what's going on. But they climbed in the elevator. So I don't know what came over me. I just came on the elevator with them. So I was the last one on and the first one off. So when we stopped at that floor, I went to the right and they went to the left. So I just turned around and then I wound up being the last one online. We were all lined up in the hallway and one at a time, the models were going in and out of this suite. So when it was my turn, I walked in and saw these people that I didn't know, being green and not knowing who's who. But it was the photographer, Irving Penn. There was the editor of Italian Vogue there. There was the designer, Basile. He was there too, and I guess another assistant. Mr. Penn was the one that asked me, are you with an agency? And I said, no, I'm sorry, I think I'm in the wrong place. So I went to turn around and he said, no, come here. So he asked me, did I have any photos? So I had a color slide at that particular time. So he saw the one he liked, he took that from me, and then he asked me my name and phone number. And 3 days later, I got a phone call saying that I was booked for Italian Vogue and it was going to be a 2-day shoot.
Wow.
And that's how my career started.
Wow. Literally just these opportunities came and you were like, something is telling me, there's an intuition within me that's telling me, follow these girls.
Yes.
Get on this elevator. Oh, I went the wrong way. Let me go follow where they went.
Exactly.
And
It was
it.
overwhelming what happened because
Yeah.
I felt like I wasn't in control of my limbs. And it was just a reaction that I did. And
Yeah.
I became who I am.
I love it. Well, Juliana, what about you? I mean, do you have a moment or moments where you just had to trust intuition to get you to where you wanted to be in your career?
I feel like I took a lot of risks. I definitely had to take a lot of risk and suffered through periods of financial precarity for sure, just general precarity. Like I remember the first time I got an eviction notice on my apartment because after I quit my day job, I had saved up some money, but really only enough to last me a few months. And so I really had to trust that what I wanted to create and put out into the world would eventually be able to support me. And I've always been a hustler. And so I think at a certain point, I did all sorts of jobs. Like there was a point where it's like I was doing catering, I was doing art performances when I could do them, I was doing modeling sometimes. And so yeah, I would say I just had to hustle a lot and trust that I wasn't gonna end up completely out here.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky that that didn't happen.
It almost sounds like, those game shows where they have to like jump from one really high thing to the next thing.
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like from both of y'all's careers. It's like you got to that point where you were at the edge of where you were then, and you just had to take that leap to jump to the next thing and hope you didn't fall, into whatever the like kiddie pool that they have waiting for you at the bottom.
Sure.
So I'm also curious about maybe how things have shifted, right? So obviously there may have been some barriers earlier on in your career and in your journey. And I wonder what you have seen in your industries in terms of just like a change in acceptance maybe, or a change in maybe receptiveness to what you have to offer as a Black trans model or a Black trans artist and creator.
Even back then in the 70s and 80s, there weren't names for us. In the ball community, we were called femme queens. So in the straight world, I was just Tracey Norman. And so I had this opportunity, and my agency sent me out to Essence Magazine. And I worked for them for the first time, and it went well, you know. And I met the photographer, I met the stylist and the hair person, and in fact, that he came in after I got my makeup done. He came in, and he was developing this makeup line called the Rasta wig. And so nobody knew that he had it on his head. It was this short roster that he had done, and he took it off of his head and put it on mine. And so when that happened on the set, they put this big choker on me, and that was like a marriage ring to a specific tribe in Africa. And then the second time that I came was 2 years later, where I was literally on the set, and I was in front of the camera taking photos, and the editor of Essence Magazine was there, the photographer, the makeup artist, and 2 lay people that was there helping the photographer, his assistants. And so as I'm taking my photos, the editor wanted me to pretend that I was Cleopatra sailing down the Nile. So once I got into character, I started getting tunnel vision. And so I was developing the character in my head, and I was actually feeling like I was on this boat sailing down the Nile. And the photographer was excited of what I was doing. The editor was excited of what I was doing. And she was telling me how beautiful the pictures are coming out. And then she said, "Tracey, you got the best stare in the business," I guess because I didn't blink, you know, while I was taking the photos. And so as I'm still taking photos, all of a sudden, so a person comes in the left side of the room, because that's where the door was, the entrance of the studio. And then I instantly lost my tunnel vision on that side. So it was like a fog. I'm looking at the camera, but it was like a fog on both sides, and I couldn't see to the left or the right. I was just focusing on the camera. And so it just felt negative as soon as that person stepped into the room. At the time, I didn't know why. And I started losing concentration, and that person called over the editor. They were having a conversation. The photographer knew that I was losing, you know, my concentration, so he told me to rest. So I did, and I, you know, got out of got out of my position that I was in to rest and relax in the chair. So at some point, I did glance to my left to see who was there, and it was one of the hair people from the first photo shoot. And he was the one that came in and spoke to Susan. And then Susan went over to the photographer, spoke to the photographer, and she was looking at me on set. Then she looked in the photo box, looking at me, looking at the photo box, and then said, "Tracey, I think we have it." But prior to that person coming into the room, she told me that the pictures were so beautiful that she feels as though they could be the cover of the holiday issue. And then the person comes in, and then that's what happened. So literally, with that happening, my work literally stopped overnight. So when I made my phone call to see what I had to do that day, work, a test, whatever it was, or come in for a meeting, nothing. For the whole week, nothing. So eventually on Friday, that Friday, they called me in and said, "Could you come in because Zoli was to speak to you on Monday?" So we had a meeting. And then he came up with an excuse to not represent me anymore. So they never approached me. Essence never approached me about my sexuality. My agent didn't approach me about my sexuality. And so they just believed, and that was the end of my career as far as, you know, that particular time in my life. And that was back in, I think that was back in like 83.
Wow. Well, I know you've shared that story so many times,
Yeah.
but it's heart-wrenching every time I hear it. So thank you for consistently being vulnerable and using that story to just really show where the industry was, right? And I think also that we still have struggles in line with that struggle today, right?
Yeah.
It's still not easy for a Black trans woman to just try and have a career really in any industry,
It's true.
you know, especially if you're not seeking out, to be an activist or an organizer, right? Like, I think maybe that's a little bit of our saving grace is we kind of had that foundation in our work where we had community to fall back on, but we also had a career in the advocacy world, right? You at ACLU, me at places like Transgender Law Center and on and on. But what if you just want to be, the supermodel that you are, right? Or you want to be the artist or the musician, right? And not have to answer all of these questions and hold everyone else's baggage around your identity, right?
I don't think that's possible for us because the label is there to make a distinction between us, because that's when I did those interviews for New York Mag, The Cut, and
In
London.
2015.
Yes, and also for the London Times in Mary Claire, South Africa, and then that's when my story went viral, and then work started coming back in. Even Clairol called me and wanted me to come in and represent them again.
Yeah.
So I didn't know at the time. An agency had contacted me, but they had to go through several different people to get in touch with me. And finally, they got in touch with my best friend, Douglas. And he was the one that contacted me. And it took a minute for him to convince me to take the meeting because of rejection that I've had. And it really, hit me hard. So I wasn't able to trust. And so I didn't really know what it was about. So it really literally took 5 days of him talking to me, and it was like, Tracey, come on, what do you have to lose? It may be a good opportunity for you. It's like, you always say, if an opportunity arises, you walk through that door because you don't know if it's good or bad. You may come out with a contract, you may not. But at least you walk through the door. And I've always had that frame of mind. But I didn't have it then because I was in my own head, and letting the rejection get a part of me. So I did, and then, all of these other people were calling me, like designers were calling me, and companies were calling me to represent them. And now I'm fortunate enough at my age to have an agent.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's striking that this resurgence in your career, came about starting in 2015. We're in what a lot of people call the trans visibility era, for better or worse. And a lot of that sparked by people like Laverne Cox being on Orange is the New Black, people like Janet Mock making strides in media.
Yes.
But of course, Juliana, you were already on this trajectory, particularly on social media, of being visible in a way, right? But maybe more so for your work. Can you talk a little bit more about what it's been like to kind of see these shifts around visibility? And of course, I think now we know there's a bit of a backlash against anything that is different.
Sure. I think I can relate to what Tracey was saying about, at a certain point, having a sense of distrust, because I started all of my career trajectories before being trans was really a thing, or at least a thing to the degree where it's like every person has an opinion on it, every person is thinking about this term, it's supercharged. And so I remember getting booked, and it's not like I was ever, I was lucky because of, pioneers like Tracey. I was able to never have to be in the closet or hide my transness, but that's very different than being brought in because of your transness. And so for me, particularly making figurative work that uses representations of myself and representations of people, and also working in fashion, because I was doing both of them kind of concurrently. And I remember this feeling when then it's like the booking started to shift. At a certain point, it's like, you have a really interesting look, we love your look, let's come in. At one point it was like, I always have like a specific makeup aesthetic. People would book me for that, or I had different hair, or my style, or whatever. And that era was really great for me. But then as there was a public desire to use transness to symbolize progress, I remember getting bookings where it's like, are you booking me because you're interested in me? Or are you booking me because someone in your office is just like manic and it's like, we need a trans person, get a trans person now.
Yes.
And I was like, I remember this period of time where I was like, this is kind of overwhelming. And also there were times where, you know, you would go to castings and people would say things like, oh, we thought you would look more trans. It's like, ooh, like, what does that mean? And so I consciously stopped taking a lot of work because of this sense of distrust where it's like, am I just being used in a context that's not really being thought through? Like, am I going to be put in a context where I'm being fed to people that would want to harm me, or am I being used in such a way that could stoke the kind of increasing cultural inflammation surrounding what trans people are or are not. At a certain point, what was important for me, regardless of what I do in art or in any field for that matter, was to make sure that, yes, I'm a trans person and I'm always aware of that. I'm aware that I'm a Black person. I'm so many things, but I want to exist in a way and I want to take jobs, particularly jobs in representational fields, that make sure that people have freedom to do multiple things. Like, I don't want to reify the idea that my value is only because I'm a trans person and that's what's hot right now, because that's also unsustainable for a career. It's not helpful for trans people to tokenize them in that way. And so, yeah, I worked through a lot of distrust and just kind of like, what are the motivations of other people? Yes. And then beyond that, what are the ramifications of how I'm being represented? Yeah. What does my representation in this context do or not do for myself, for the larger public, for ideas of like, yeah.
I mean, I hear so much richness there just around being able to show up and having the choice to show up how you want to show up, right? Yes. Like having agency, having bodily autonomy, having self-determination, right? Like all of these values are key in maybe a project or a brand or a line being actually inclusive. And I'm also curious, I mean, what are those things? What are those demands that you have of the industry to lessen maybe some of those barriers that you experienced before?
I'm not sure if we have the power to demand certain things, because even though I was doing those interviews as I discussed with you, I told all three interviewers that I don't identify as trans, I identify as a woman, because that's how I lived my life. I worked as a woman, being a model, and so I understood the game when the magazines put trans to my name, because seeing my photos, it made a difference in how people looked at me. It helped sales for them. It helped boost my recognition. So I just played along. But now I'm more relaxed with the term, because when I was outed, the difference between me back then, it was never heard of. And then me being a woman of color was really another level of not possible. So today's girls, you guys can out yourselves. So people from my past had power over me, as I was, discussing that earlier with you. They had the power to either blackmail me, which never happened, but to out me, which happened.
Which is a blacklisting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you girls have outed yourselves, so nobody had that power over you. And so I congratulate you, for that. So you're able to live way more comfortable than I did. Because when my career was shooting through the roof because of discovery of a famous photographer, that's when I got nervous. In the beginning, I was not nervous. I was just going with the flow. Oh, wow, hey, oh, it's exciting, I'm traveling here, I'm going there, I'm shooting in magazines. Mommy, look, look, look. But as my career started shooting through the roof, that's when I got really, really nervous of, oh my God, it's today to day. you know. And I would say a prayer before I leave the house. Please, Lord, don't let anybody disrespect me, call me out of a name, or try to embarrass me. Every single day, I would, when I leave the house to go on a go-see, to go photos, to go to the job, I would do that. And then in my mind, I got kind of relaxed for a second because in my mind, it was a job. It became a job, modeling. Even though it's exciting, it became a job. And I had gotten my first, with my check from Clairol, I had got my first apartment on 70th and West End Avenue. I was like, yes! So when I moved in, it was me, some clothes that I had, and my fur baby, my dog. And that was my mentality at the time. I had rent to pay and a baby to feed.
Yeah.
So it didn't dawn on me until, you know, I started working a lot, that this could possibly happen and I could lose all of this. And then it came to pass.
Well, I definitely think you have power, and I feel like you are expressing that power, right? Being able to share your truth is a power and has changed so many people's perspectives on who can be a supermodel, who can be respected, right? And also, I mean, now you have the dimension of being seasoned,
Yes.
right? And so that is opening doors also for models regardless of age. So I want to let you know that I see your power, we see your power, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you both.
What about you, Juliana? I mean, what demands or shifts do you want to see in the industries you're a part of?
For me, I think it's really important that the desire to signify progress in representation and in images and in media is matched with changing the material conditions and progress within the larger structures that produce those images, because images themselves are not the same thing as transforming the world. And so even on a kind of like just industry level, and I think this, because art is also so visual and I work in photography, that's why it was really important for me. I photograph myself. When I photograph other people, I photograph them. The parts of what I do that are normally like, there's some unnamed man behind a camera who's usually getting paid and then is presumed to have the ability to produce the actual images themselves. Like, it was important for me to do that. And what I would love to see in fashion, for example, is meaningful diversity in all aspects. And so it would be great to see people that are in agencies, are starting agencies, photographers, producers, like production companies, like so that across the board there's real representation of how the world is changing and is like complexifying and really getting more diverse, because there's so many horrible things that happen on set. Like, I remember when I was really doing like modeling before my art stuff started taking off, like there was years where that was my main source of income. And being alone on sets and having photographers try and ask to take naked photos of me that they could then sell and I would get a cut or something, just really edgy stuff, like shoots in Paris where people are making the most unhinged comments about my skin color in rooms full of people and nobody says anything. I would like to see things like that get better, and I never, it's always kind of, particularly with modeling, it always felt like I feel lucky to be able to do this. It's like I never want to be unself-aware about the context that I'm in, but it can be really intense and you're really vulnerable to so many dynamics that are in the structure that's producing the image that you are ultimately a part of. And I think it would be really meaningful if all elements that go into the production of these images and the media would represent the same progress that is purportedly being signaled. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you modeled this so wonderfully in your work, right? This idea that you're not just the muse or the talent in that sense, right? That you also have the wherewithal to construct an image that is fuller and more expansive than maybe the next person who doesn't understand your context, your experience, your body, what you've been through, what you're striving for. And so I thank you, because I think that that is a brilliant model for what we need to see in the industry.
Yeah.
Just as you said, like, we have trans people who are gifted with the lens, right? Who can write the editorial, right, for the story, who can ask the questions in different ways so that we can get into the nooks and crannies, the nuances of our experiences. And then the scouting, right? You know, there's so much there. And I think it's also for us too, even with the struggles we've had in our various industries, more so for me in media and journalism, because I've often been behind the scenes, though I have been asked to be the talent too sometimes. There can be just a very limiting idea of how transness exists, right? And so if you excel in something, then you can become the prototype of that, if that makes sense, right? So Juliana, when you were talking about, you know, the comments around, well, you don't look trans enough, right? I just think about, you know, so many of the girls who can't be in rooms like this, right, because they're told they look too trans, right? I'm sure we have all had in our careers where it's like, we know part of the reason that we've had access is because we look a certain way, right? Or there's like an assumed assimilation around our experiences, right? Not to mention all the different ways that trans people can also be disabled, right? You know, colorism is also a thing, right? I know that I've often benefited in ways that my darker sisters have not, right? And siblings have not. So there's so much here to unpack, but I appreciate that we can be in a space where we can talk about these true things. And I hope that the fashion industry, the art industry, media writ large will continue to have these conversations. So thank y'all for chewing on all of this with us. Thank you to our InStylers who are also here with us, just like in the pocket, talking about the hard things, but also the hopeful things. And here's to the next slate of amazing, brilliant, Black, trans, everything leaders that are coming to storm through as well.